Hi, welcome to Justin's Morning Coffee. All right, so today I want to talk about something a little bit different, but similar, related to film. And that's the distinction I want to make between something I'm calling mythos and anecdote. I'm not sure if those are exactly the right words, but I'm just working out the idea right now. So I'd love to hear what you guys think of it. You could also think of it as this kind of how we exist in the modern world today, where there is a gulf or a divorce between meaning and fact. So you can kind of think of meaning as up being up here and fact down here, or I'm saying anecdote down here. Um, so to illustrate this, I'm going to have to sort of slowly tease out this idea to you, and I'm going to do it by showing a couple of clips. The first clip is going to be from a documentary called Room 237, and it's a documentary that you can watch on the streaming services, probably Amazon, it may be on Netflix. That's basically just a whole bunch of people talking about Stanley Kubrick and talking about The Shining. And it's basically these filmmakers went out and they just got all of these amateur lay people, and they had them explain their theory of what the meaning of The Shining was, what the meaning of the movie was. So let me show you this clip real quick, and then we'll talk about it.
We are dealing with a guy who has a 200 IQ. I believe that when Stanley Kubrick finished with Barry Lyndon, he was bored. He had conquered the filmmaking landscape. He had succeeded in making masterpiece after masterpiece, and he was bored. Barry Lyndon is a boring movie. It is wonderfully shot. It is beautifully costumed, but it is a film made by a guy who's bored. And I could see that. And so I think Stanley retreated after Barry Lyndon, and he began working on a new kind of film, a film that had never been made before, a film that was made by a bored genius who had thoroughly emptied the jug of everything that could be done in filmmaking. And
Okay, so what did he say there? So his contention is this layperson that's giving us his grand theory of the meaning of the Stanley Kubrick, is that he's a genius. He has an over 200 IQ, and he was bored after making Barry Lyndon, and so he funneled all of his intelligence into the making of The Shining. Okay, so that means that every frame, every part of the frame, every compositional element, every piece of set dressing can be scrutinized and analyzed and cross-referenced because it's saturated with meaning. And why is it saturated with meaning? Because it was made by a super intelligent person, Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick was, what do they say? He was obsessive compulsive. There's another documentary called Film Worker, which is a documentary about the personal assistant of Stanley Kubrick, and it's just he was obsessive compulsive, and he was obsessed about everything, and he put little elements in the frame. Every single prop, every single piece of writing on every prop had meaning. And so you could just follow those clues, follow those Easter eggs throughout his films, and then they would also relate to other films that he had made. And so there's a sense that up here, you could say, perhaps, up here in the realm of the mythos, or in the realm of fiction, the realm of fiction film, you can have meaning and layers and layers and layers of meaning, okay? But in our world, post-enlightenment, post-modern, post-reformation, post everything, what about down here, the realm of the fact? Can that have meaning? And so this is the interesting thing. We seem to have this sense of, if it's factual, it's very hard for that to be meaningful. But if it's fictional, if it's nonfiction, then it can be meaningful. So that's why I'm sort of thinking of it in terms of the anecdote down here and the mythos up here. Okay, so keep that in mind. Bear with me here. I'm weaving together my theory. Okay, so here's an interesting thing that happened to me. This was about a year ago, and I was texting with a buddy of mine, and my buddy didn't realize that he was being symbolic when he said this to me, but it stuck in my head. I was watching a documentary about the Beatles on HBO, and there was a scene in it where Paul McCartney was playing "The Long and Winding Road" for the first time for his bandmates, and I just was fascinated. I thought, oh my God, this is the first time anyone has ever heard "The Long and Winding Road." What an amazing thing! So I texted my buddy and I said, how are you watching this documentary? He goes, yeah. I said, it's about the creative process or something like that. I said, it's about something. And he texted back, and it was very interesting. He said, I disagree. And I said, why? And he said, it's not about anything. It's just what happened. See, there's the distinction right there. Okay. It's not about anything. It's just what happened. Okay. So the aboutness is up here. The aboutness is up here. The anecdote cannot connect up. It doesn't mean anything. It's just what happened, you know. And why did he have that skepticism, would you say? I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, maybe because sometimes we get it wrong, you know, and it's not really about that. It's, you know, but putting an interpretation on it, it's about this. It's about this. There's this aversion that we have. It gets our hackles up. It gets, you know, it's like, it's like, no, you can't tell me what it's about. So to play it safe, what do? We say, well, it's not about anything. It's just what happened, you know. And so you can see this kind of like cagey nature that artists have a lot of times. David Lynch is like this, you know. Oh, I'm not going to tell you what it means. It depends on what you think it means, you know. Kind of that thing, you know. Your truth, my truth, you know, that sort of thing. Okay, so it's not about anything. It's just what happened. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a clip from this is a documentary called Capturing Reality, a great little documentary about documentary filmmaking. And you can notice all of these documentary filmmakers, they're circling around this issue. They're playing around with this issue. Okay, so let's take a look at that.
I tell the story in a way where I'm searching for, not for just the facts. I'm into something which gives you deeper insight, into an essence, into a concentration of something that is way beyond facts, and that is truth, as an ecstasy of truth, as I sometimes call it. Otherwise, facts are not that interesting. If you want to have facts, go and buy yourself the phone directory of Manhattan. You've got 8 million entries, and they're all correct. They're all facts, but they do not constitute anything.
Okay, so so isn't that interesting? So what Werner Herzog here is saying is the facts, if they're not connected up here, are meaningless, right? So again, it's not about anything. It's just what happened. That would mean what? Well, it doesn't mean anything either, you know, in some sense. You know, I don't think that's what my buddy was saying, but there is this tension. You notice the tension, right? It's, well, if I just tell you a bunch of things that are factual, you're going to go, so? Right? That's your desire to connect it up to something that's meaningful. So why are you telling me this? You know? Okay, so that's Werner Herzog. Now, Herzog, he's an interesting character because I think when he talks about ecstatic truth, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about mythos. Okay, and I'm going to define what I mean by mythos for you guys as we go along here. But okay, so that's one layer of what belongs up here, let's say. Okay, Werner Herzog's sense of ecstatic truth belongs up here, and then the fact down here. Now, in Herzog's case, he says that this anecdote is meaningless unless it's connected to here. Now, the interesting thing is that for Herzog, sometimes this doesn't actually have to be factual, you know, so that's where he's controversial. So let's keep watching and see where the other filmmakers go with this.
With a documentary, there's an agreement with the audience that you are referencing or giving an account of evidence-based reality, that you are actually saying, this is the way the world is as I see it. And that has very little to do with whether you use actors or recreations or anything, really, except that there's an agreement that this is an account of reality. People have a sense when that is violated. I just discovered that Werner Herzog, when he did Little Dieter Needs to Fly, he had this scene where Dieter comes home to his house in California, and he opens and closes the door several times. Because he was a prisoner in Laos, he can't feel shut in. So he opens and closes the door quickly to make sure it's unlocked. And it's a very powerful moment, and I always remember it in the film. Total bullshit. Herzog made that up and made him do it. And it is a wonderful dramatization of the guy's theme. But I think that's a lie.
Okay, so... All right, so Werner Herzog says the phone book is just a list of facts. Okay, the facts are meaningless unless they connect up to what he calls ecstatic truth, which I'm calling mythos. Okay, so in his case, he can say, well, I can actually fudge the facts a little bit in order to get them to connect up. You know, so when in Little Dieter Needs to Fly, he had him reenact something that is true. It's true of Little Dieter. He can't feel shut in. And so in order to dramatize that ecstatic truth, which is this truth about the character of the man, let's say, he invents a little reenactment that illustrates that higher truth. Okay, now this other filmmaker says, well, that's cheating. You can't do that. You can only use real facts. But then it gets tricky, because what isn't a reenactment already inherently a lie? You know, so if you're putting in reenactments in your documentary, then already you're kind of moving away from the strict sort of fact thing. So my buddy's line, it doesn't mean anything. It's just what happened. Well, in this case, it's like, well, if you just put what happened, it won't mean anything. You might say, you know, for Werner Herzog. So what it comes down to, according to this other filmmaker, was that there's an agreement that has to happen. Now, listen to what Manfred here is going to say about Michael Moore. Okay, so now this is another layer of the ethics of this negotiation between fact and meaning, anecdote and mythos, fact and ecstatic truth.
Basically, he makes polemical films where he carefully constructs a reality to serve his needs. And he's blatant about it, and he's careful in checking his facts. But when you see his film, which are hugely popular and have done a great deal for us documentarians, but he commits, some people would say, crimes towards the art form of documentary.
Okay, so now what's going on? So in this case, he's saying that Michael Moore uses facts, but he's using them in service to a political agenda, and therefore he's in the realm of propaganda. Maybe he's using it for the means of power. Maybe, you know. So now there's another layer there of this negotiation. Is Michael Moore's political agenda ecstatic truth, or is Herzog saying, no, I'm going for something higher than the political? I'm going for the eternal. I'm going for mythos. I'm going for the archetypal, you might say. Okay, and so political is a little farther down, and if you're massaging facts to benefit the political, that's not the same thing as massaging facts to benefit the ecstatic truth or the mythos, maybe. So as you see, I mean, this is just going to keep getting more and more complicated. Okay, so let's keep going.
I mean, let's not be too sort of saintly about this. I think filmmaking and documentary making is a very subjective process, and anybody who tries to present themselves as telling the truth in some way is perpetrating a fraud, because it's just impossible.
This idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that truth is subjective, there's truth for you, there's truth for me, For me, that's nonsense talk. There's a real world. We inhabit that real world. Things happen. Someone sits in the driver's seat of that car and pulls the trigger. That's not up for grabs. There's not this guy's truth and that guy's truth. There's the truth of what actually happened that night.
When you see a film and you have good reason.
Okay, so that was Errol Morris, another one of the giants in the documentary filmmaking world, and so he's saying there's objective truth out there. It's not your truth. It's not my truth. It's not subjective like the previous documentary filmmaker had said, and the idea is that Errol Morris is trying to get to that objective truth. But he's using reenactments to do it. So every one of these filmmakers can accuse the other one of lying, if you notice. It shows just how complicated this issue is to talk about, All right, so let's move on now. This is kind of like the way that I think Werner Herzog thinks about it. You've got your lowercase t truths, facts on the ground, anecdotes, and in order for them to be meaningful, they have to connect up to the symbolic, to ecstatic truth, to the archetypes, the 30,000-foot view, something like that. The universal, right? So it's from the anecdote up to the example or the analogy, and then all the way up to the archetype, something like that. And so this is the task, according to Herzog, of the artist, is to get up to there. And then these guys are all disagreeing about the proper way to do that. Errol Morris is talking about the objective truth, the truth of the world that we inhabit. And you might say Werner Herzog is talking about the archetypal truth, which is also part of the world that we inhabit, right? But not in the same way, perhaps. Okay, so I'm gonna show you one more thing. If you go back and look at some of my material under the documentary playlist, I've shown this before. But this is Ira Glass, who is a reporter, a documentary radio reporter for NPR, and he's done This American Life for years. And this is a little talk that he gives on how he constructs meaning out of anecdotes, meaning out of factual instances. And so I think this is relevant as well to what we're talking about.
I mean, one of the things I think is really important if you're making stories for television or radio is that you understand the building blocks of the stories. And there are different ways to think about this. One of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to think about it the way that you learned in high school, which is in high school, we're all taught that the way that you write is that there's like a topic sentence, and then there's like the facts which fill out the argument. In broadcasting, it's completely different. In broadcasting, I think you have two basic building blocks, and they're very powerful, and you can use them as you will. And one is the anecdote. And an anecdote is literally just a sequence of actions. If you think of it as just like what is a story in its purest form? A story in its purest form is somebody saying, this happened, and that led to this next thing, and that led to this next thing, and that led to this next thing, like one thing following another. And some of the things in the sequence can be, and that made me think of this, and then I said this. Like there could be thoughts and ideas as part of it, but like one is leading to the next, leading to the next. And the power of the anecdote is so great that no matter how, in a way, like no matter how boring the material is, if it's in a story form where there's an anecdote happening, and then he said this to me, and then I went here, and then I came downstairs, and I thought, like, what the hell? Like, it has a momentum in and of itself. Okay, so you have the building block, which is like the actual sequence of actions, the anecdote part of it. This thing happened, and then this thing, and then this thing. That's one building block. Then the other big building block, your other tool, is that you have a moment of reflection. And by that I mean, at some point, somebody's got to say, here's why the hell you're listening to this story. Like, here's the point of the story. Here's the bigger something that we're driving at. Here's why I'm wasting your time with all this. And one of the things that's very, very unfortunate for people who are launching into the kinds of jobs that all the people who are making video pods are launching into, one of the things that's so very sad, and it's like the bane of my existence, and it's the bane of anybody's existence who does this kind of work, is that often you have the two parts of this, the two parts of the structure. You've got the anecdote and you've got the moment of reflection. And often you'll have an anecdote which just kills. It's just so interesting. Like this thing happens and it leads to the next and it leads to the next, and it's so surprising and so many things happen. You meet these great characters and it means absolutely nothing. Like it's just completely predictable. It doesn't tell you anything new. And so that's one huge problem. And then the other huge problem is you got a kind of boring set of facts or boring story, right? That actually like somebody actually has something kind of interesting to say about it. And so actually I think a lot of us when we're beginning, we get caught in the problem of we know we've got something here. We know that there's something here that's kind of compelling, but it just doesn't seem to be coming together. And often it's your job to be kind of ruthless and to understand that either you don't have a sequence of actions, you don't have the story part that works, or you don't have a moment of reflection that works. And you're going to need both. And in a good story, you're going to flip back and forth between the two. Like there'll be a little bit of action and then someone will say something about it, and there'll be a little more action and someone will say something. And that's really like a lot of the trick of the whole thing.
Okay, wow. So a couple of interesting things that he says there. So he's saying that you have your anecdote down here, and you may have an anecdote that seems super compelling, but it doesn't connect up to here in any way. And so you can't really use it, because it's a meaningless fact. It's what my buddy said. It doesn't mean anything. It's just what happened, But on the other hand, you could have something that maybe is connecting here really well, but it's not exactly true. It does mean something, but it's not what happened. Right? Exactly. And then the other thing is that he's saying in there is that there's this implication that when you raise a question, that there's an answer. And so I think that there is an inherent, what would you say? Like a modus operandi of the human condition, that we are always trying to connect our lives, the experience of our lives, the anecdote, the sense data, etc., up to this realm of the symbolic, the archetypal, the ecstatic truth, the mythos. And so in Ira Glass's case, he just says, well, I have to use facts, but I just throw out all the ones that don't connect up to here. But so is that really, in our modern sense of truth, is that really truthful? You're just letting all these other facts go by because they don't connect up to here. And then you're just choosing the ones that do. Yeah, it's tough to talk about this stuff. Okay, so next. Now let's take a look at how they do this in movies. So let's take a look at Big Fish, Tim Burton movie, great movie. And basically the movie is set up in this way, where you have the anecdote down here, and you've got the mythos up here. You've got, here's what actually happened, and here's a really good story. A meaningful story, you might say. So there's meaning up here, and there's fact down here, but they don't connect. So let's take a look at the very first scene that I'm going to show you to set up this idea of mythos and anecdote in Big Fish.
But on that day, I had a revelation. Now, I tried everything on it. Worms, lures, peanut butter and cheese. I was gonna have to use something he truly desired. If that fish was the ghost of Henry Walls, then the usual bait wasn't gonna work.
Your finger?
Gold. And then I cast upriver.
And just as fast, he snapped clean through that line. You see my predicament. My wedding ring, this child, was now lost in the gut of an uncatchable fish.
What did you do?
I could gut that fish and get my wedding ring back. The whole time we're calling it a him, when in fact it was a her. But in doing so, I became the smartest catfish in the Ashton River. That was the lesson I learned that day, the day my son was born.
Okay, very interesting. All right, so what was the anecdote, the anecdotal, and what was the mythos? All right, so we start with this story about this fish. We have our protagonist, or the father of the protagonist, telling these children the story about a wedding ring and the fish, and how he knew that the only way to catch the fish was with the gold of the wedding ring. And then he's telling it later to this bridesmaid. And everybody's fascinated by this story. But meanwhile, the son is upset. Why? Well, because that's not really what happened on the day of his birth. He wasn't even there on the day of his birth. Or he was in Wichita on the day of his birth. And so he is upset about that. So you can kind of think of it this way. So you've got your mythos up here, and you've got your anecdote down here, and then you've got your believers, you might say, in these plot types. Okay, so this isn't the only version of this. I find it in movies all over the place. So you've got one set of characters that believe in the mythos, and then you've got your skeptic over here. Now, the skeptic in this case is right in the sense that that is not factually true. It's maybe Werner Herzog's idea of ecstatic truth. It's the mythic. It's the thing that we want, the thing that we strive, how we wish life would be, that everything would make sense like that. That there would be a fish out there. I can remember even when I was a kid and we would drive by Mono Lake, which is this big salt lake up near where I lived in the Eastern Sierra. And one of the dads in our group driving us to baseball games or whatever it was had a story about a monster that lived in Mono Lake. And we would be driving, all the kids in the back seat, and he's driving and there's Mono Lake. And he's talking about the monster that lives in Mono Lake, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, et cetera, et cetera. That all belongs up here in the mythos realm, let's say. Okay, so now we have our skeptics and our believers. Let's watch one more scene to kind of set up the dynamic now between the father and the son.
The context for your great adventure.
Come on, Will, everyone loves that story.
No, I don't love that story, not anymore. I know every punchline. Which never happened, incidentally. You were selling novelty products in Wichita the day I was born.
After that night, I didn't speak to my father again for 3 years.
I'm sorry to embarrass you.
You're embarrassing yourself, Dad. You just don't see it.
Okay, so you're embarrassing yourself, Dad. You just don't see it. Because the dad lives completely up here, lives completely up in the mythic, in the mythos realm. And the son lives completely down here in the anecdotal. It doesn't mean anything. It's just what happened. Okay, so I'm going to get to the end of Big Fish, but I want to introduce one more movie into this mix that has a similar structure, so that we can kind of see how it's kind of like playing itself out in these narratives. I talked a little bit about a couple of videos ago on my channel on this movie called Light from Light, which stars Jim Gaffigan in a serious role, and Marilyn Ireland playing opposite him. And it's a small independent film. I saw it at Sundance maybe about 5 years ago. But it was an amazing experience because it was one of the most emotional film premieres I've ever seen. And it just stuck with me over the years, and what was that movie about? So essentially what you have is the mythos in this case is the belief in ghosts. So she basically plays someone who looks for ghosts, a ghost hunter type, and she's got recording equipment and video cameras and things that she looks for supernatural phenomena. Okay, so she's looking for the mythos. But there's an interesting thing because in this movie, they have this longing for that to be true. And that's one of the things that you'll notice about conspiracy theorists or people into Bigfoot or people into Loch Ness Monster or et cetera, or ghosts in this case, is the sense of a desire for it to be true. So it's not a sense of, I'm just kind of looking at what the evidence showed me, but this kind of sense of that's what the mythos, it has not just like a fictional quality, I don't want to say fictional, but an otherworldly quality, but it has also this pull, this desire in it, embedded within that sort of concept. Certainly with Werner Herzog, I think that's the case. Certainly with the big fish, the stories, the stories just, they all connect together. They're just so good. They're just so satisfying, you know? And so the son is really in Big Fish is kind of lamenting the fact maybe that didn't actually happen. That's not the way it really went down. But there's this desire that wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where that was true, where the anecdote did connect up to the mythos, right? And so Jim Gaffigan then plays someone who lost his wife, and he hears her on the radio. And she's saying, well, I'm a ghost hunter. And he decides he wants to hire her, so he calls her up. She goes out to the house, and he tells the story about how his wife died in a plane crash up on the top of the mountain, and that he thought that maybe he saw some supernatural phenomena. You know, the light was flickering on and off. The keys had moved from one side of the table to another. And she goes, okay, so I'm going to now investigate it from like a scientific perspective. I'm going to set up cameras. I'm going to do all this stuff. All right, so I'm going to show you the opening scene of the movie, and just to kind of set this up, and then we'll kind of get into how this anecdote versus mythos plays out in this movie.
And do you still have those dreams now?
At some point, I just stopped telling people about them.
And did you have other experiences with the paranormal before joining the team?
I had questions.
Like?
Just questions.
Would you consider yourself a believer or a skeptic?
About ghosts? I don't know. I don't know what I am.
Okay, so there you have it. So is she a believer or is she a skeptic? And she says, well, I don't know what I am. With respect to what? Well, again, it's with respect to, do you believe in the mythos or not? Or do you live only down here in the anecdote? So, you know, I'm kind of plotting it now. I'm thinking of it in terms of wilderness and promised land. Okay, so there's some sense, and I'm going to show you another clip that I think will kind of illustrate this, that the mythos belongs over here, the land of milk and honey, the promised land, the place where things make sense, the place where things connect up to meaning, where action and meaning are finally joined. It's kind of a union of these two things that are separated in our world, okay? So there's a sense of the wilderness. Now, here's the interesting thing. Even for the believer, which is going to be Jim Gaffigan's character here, there's a sense that they still, most of their everyday life is lived down here. And there are only very, very few moments in life where this actually touches this, where the mythos come down or the anecdote comes up. They're few and far between. Okay, so think of it in terms of the friend that you have that had this one, religious experience, or this one ecstatic experience. My grandfather has this one time in Spain where he went to this one cathedral and he had this experience of awe. That's him, touching the mythos maybe in that one sense. And so he's constantly looking back at that. You can think of it in terms of within the religious communities, you'll have stories that are residing in the mythos. That one time that person got healed, that one time that person spoke in tongues, that one time that person was raised from the dead, if you want to go way back, that one time that something mythic happened and it was also factual. It wasn't just up here, it actually touched down here. But even if you believe that, 9 times out of 10, 90% of your life, well, I don't want to put a percentage on it, but a lot of your life is going to be lived over here where those things are actually still separated. You might remember back to that one time. Think of it in terms of the Exodus story. They're out in the wilderness and they're the Song of Miriam, these different kind of like rituals and songs and everything, going back to that one time that the Red Sea was parted, the one time that Yahweh led people out from Pharaoh, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sense of, in this world of our experience, we don't live over here yet. So even if you are a believer or a hopeful skeptic, in her case, you still have this sense of living in the desert. And so now let's watch another scene and you'll kind of get the sense of the longing that these characters have. the longing for this mythic promised land, the longing for the mythos to be true. And there's a sense in this one, whereas in Big Fish, maybe not, but in this one, there's a sense of it needs to be true in order for me to be happy. In order for me to be able to go on, in Jim Gaffigan's case, after the death of his wife, he needs to be able to believe in an afterlife. That's part of his healing process, you might say. Okay, so let's watch one more scene.
It felt like something had its hand on me.
Was the hand strong? Was it forceful?
It was gentle. Felt like my wife, Suzanne. Feels like she's still here.
She died when?
It'll be 12 years in April. This library was here when we moved in. She was always trying to get me to read. This is where I thought I saw my keys move. It happened a few times. I had my vision examined. I was baptized and everything, but I don't go to church. Suzanne did. This is the room where the lights were flickering.
Is anyone here? If you are here and would like to communicate, let yourself be known. If you'd like to communicate, let yourself be known. Is anyone here?
But if it was her, if there is an afterlife, then maybe that's why she's here, because she's lonely. She wants me to be with her. People think ghosts are scary. I think it would be wonderful if they were real.
There was this one time I had an experience with a ghost. My father. I was walking home. I thought I saw him at the mailbox. I was sworn I saw him there putting something in the mailbox, and then walks away into the distance. So I ran after him, kind of dissolved away, and I opened the box and looked inside. I mean, there was nothing there. But I felt this sense. It was like my heart was going to explode. Like I felt really alive.
Okay, so very interesting. So he shows her, the phenomenon that he thinks could be the mythos, could be the ghost. Where's my mouse? Could be the mythos. And then she says, "Okay, we're gonna rationally kind of figure this out." But notice when she's walking around at night in the dark, it sounds like a ritualistic prayer that she's saying for this ghost. If you're there, please speak. So there's this kind of speaking into the spiritual realm, and it's this. Maybe that's what a prayer is. It's this upward movement to the mythos, and it's kind of saying, if you're there, please make yourself known in our world down here. And then there's the great scene where you see the serious acting chops of Jim Gaffigan, where he says what? He says, I'm not really afraid of ghosts. It would just be so cool if it were true. So this is kind of like the opposite of the, well, he's not a believer either yet. He's kind of still skeptical, but he wants it to be true, as opposed to the son in Big Fish, who is angry that it's not true. So that's that. I have to think that represents two sort of archetypal elements of two types of ways of existing in the world. One way is believing, or at least hoping, that this is true, or hoping that it connects down somehow. And another one of being angry at the world for it not connecting, angry at his father for this not being true. I'm giving away the ending a little bit here because because I'm showing the scene from the end. So all right. So now what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to show the ending of Big Fish, and what are we gonna be looking for? We're gonna be looking for whether or not this mythos, whether or not all the stories from the father are finally going to connect down to the actual world.
Trying to have a heartfelt talk. One of my greatest annoyances is when people try to talk to those who can't hear them.
My father and I never talk.
Your father ever tell you about the day you were born?
He caught an uncatchable fish.
The rail story. He ever tell you that?
No.
Well, your mother came in about 3 in the afternoon. You were born a week early. Your father was sorry not to be there. But it wasn't accustomed then men to be in the room for deliveries. And that's the real story of how you were born. Not very exciting, is it? And I suppose if I had to choose between the true version and an elaborate one involving a fish, I might choose the fancy version.
Dad? The river?
Tell me how it happened.
How what happens? I need your help. Tell me how it starts.
Like this.
It's in the morning, and you and I are in the hospital, and I'd fallen asleep in the chair, and I'd wake up.
Let's get out of here.
And I said, you're in no condition.
Get that wheelchair.
Old red Charger is there, but it's new, brand new, and I pick you up.
Where are we going?
The river.
He's here!
It's unbelievable.
The story of my life. Goodbye, everybody.
You become what you always were. A very big fish.
Exactly.
Okay. You finally became what you always were, a very big fish. So that was a fantasy sequence. The son is now taking on the story and telling it, and he doesn't care that it's not anecdotal, that it's not actually factually true. And also there's the conversation with the doctor there where he says, you know, the actual story of how you were born was pretty boring. You were born, your father wasn't allowed in because at that time they didn't allow them into the room. So wouldn't you prefer the mythic version of the story about a fish and a wedding ring and all of this elaborate kind of meaningful mythic story? And maybe in this movie, the journey of the protagonist, of the son, is from skeptic to not believer that this has become fact, but believer in maybe the power of the story, believer in what maybe Werner Herzog would call ecstatic truth, something like that. But they never touch. Notice. Now, if we were in a class right now, we were teaching a class, this is what I would ask. Do you think that it ever touched in that movie? And that's a question. You know, I think that maybe because this is a predicament in the modern world, a predicament that Nietzsche pointed out, which is that if you disconnect the mythos from the anecdotal, the mythos from the factual, you also lose all meaning, and therefore you lose all hope. That's what Jim Gaffigan is longing for in Light from Light. And maybe the son here, maybe it's a little bit tragic, because he realizes that all he's got is the story. And the only immortality that he can have is by retelling the story. But that there's no actual, I don't want to say physical, but no actual connection to the mythos, to that big fish, that catfish only exists in the form of a story. It doesn't exist in any other way. Now, I don't know a lot, but I think about this particular theologian, but I think maybe someone like Rudolf Bultmann would be, and correct me if I'm wrong here, a good example of that, where the idea was there are certain people in the postmodern age, postmodernism, post-enlightenment, that said, we're just going to throw out the mythos and just have the anecdotal. It doesn't mean anything. It's just what happened. And that's it. There is no up here. And then there's other people like, I think, Rudolf Bultmann, and maybe that's what this story represents, is to throw out this. Maybe Werner Herzog's doing that in a way. He doesn't throw it out completely, but he does say, I'd rather tell a good mythic story than let the facts get in the way of that. And so he fudges it sometimes. He reenacts, etc. And then maybe this journey of the son here in Big Fish is he's going into the realm of the mythos and he's abandoning this. But it's a tension, and you'll find, I think, that you'll find certain people leaning this way and kind of let's shed the factual and go into the archetypal, the mythic, the ecstatic truth. And then you've got other people leaning this way. Let's shed the mythos and let's just go only into the realm of non-meaning, one thing after another. Very interesting. Okay, so now let's go back to Light from Light. I think that this might be one of the reasons why, if you could have been there when this movie screened, why it was such an emotional experience for the audience. It just caught everybody by surprise. So I'm going to, unfortunately, because of YouTube, I got to really, really truncate this scene and edit it down. So you're not going to get the same experience that I got. But just think of it this way. You spend, let's say, 90 minutes of very, very slow, non-narrative scenes with these two actors where they're longing for the mythos, they're looking for the ghost, but one after another, they find that it doesn't quite work in reality. The lights flickering on and off, well, it turns out that was a rat in the basement. The keys moving back and forth, well, that was because I was tired and I wasn't thinking straight. All of these kind of stories, like she thinks she sees her deceased father putting a letter in the mailbox. She opens the mailbox, there's nothing there. So there's this longing for the mythos. So it's this idea again. They're in the wilderness and they're longing for the promised land, but they just never find it until this very last scene.
Chapter 18. Anna looked at Dolly's thin, careworn face, with its wrinkles filled with dust from the road, and she was on the point of saying what she was thinking. "You're looking at me," she said, "and wondering how I can be happy in my position. I'm inexcusably happy. Something magical has happened to me. Look up, and all the horrors are no more. I've been so happy." I've never done this. I've never felt something like this. You know, I'm just gonna try. Suzanne? Are you here? Can you come to this place to talk? Richard wants to talk with you. I'll be right outside.
So I'm sorry I couldn't do that justice. I'd like for you to be able to see the whole scene, but just trust me when I say that when we were in the premiere and in that theater and we had sat through that whole thing, and there's something about the cathedral of the quiet movie theater, the energy of the whole crowd together, that manifests the spirit in the crowd. And when that page flipped, it was the place was just full of emotion. And I remember a young woman coming up to the director to try to talk to him after. She couldn't even talk. She was so emotional, and she just was trying to communicate to him something about how he had given her closure with respect to her mother, the death of her mother. And so I find it super interesting. I really think that if you can do this, if you can set up a mythos that works, and a life down here that is longing for that to touch the mythos, and then you don't have to make it touch in an obvious way. In fact, I think it works better if it's more subtle, and it's just this little crack in our reality. The mythos just cracks in to where we are. I think that generates a lot of emotion. Because I think it symbolizes the hope for this, and what happens is we don't get to hear. We still live in that world of the factual that is not the mythical, where it is just one thing happening after another, and it doesn't always mean something. But this world, it cracks in, it breaks in, it just kind of little, I don't know what you say, little promises, little glimpses, that's just the reality that we live in. And so these moments here are very, very powerful when the mythos and the factual finally touch. So I hope that made sense. I know that was a little abstract, but essentially I want to just highlight that this can actually be a pattern that you can follow in your stories and in your screenplays and your films, that really does work. I'm telling you, it's a very, very powerful thing, and it's very, very meaningful to people. So that's it for today, and we're going to have our conference, the Quest for the Spiritual Home Conference this weekend, so I probably won't put out another video until, well, it might be a couple weeks because I'm doing a job up in Seattle, a camera job. So maybe a little bit before you hear from me, but please leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this idea. This is new for me. This is in the development stage, still trying to exactly articulate the language for it and try to get it where it really makes sense. But I think it's very interesting to me. So I will see you guys next time.